Imagine a frozen lake. The year is 1242. The temperature is well below freezing. And somewhere out on that vast white expanse, two armies are about to collide in a battle that will echo through centuries of history, mythology, and national identity. Here is the question that makes this story so fascinating. Was the battle on the ice the earth-shattering military triumph that later generations claimed it was? Was Alexander Nevsky truly the savior of Russian civilization? Or did something far more complicated happen on that frozen lake? Something that propaganda, politics, and the passage of time slowly transformed into legend. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what if the battle you think you know never quite happened the way you were told? Before we go any further, if you enjoy history told without the myths and without the filler, consider subscribing to this channel and hitting the like button. It genuinely helps us keep making these deep dives, and it means more stories like this one. Now, let us go back to the beginning. To understand why April 5th, 1242 became a date burned into the memory of an entire civilization, you need to understand the world that produced it. And that world, in the early 13th century, was one of the most violent and unstable in European history. The lands we now call Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Finland were not yet the nations we recognize today. They were a patchwork of competing principalities, tribal territories, trading republics, and expanding crusader states. The Baltic region in particular was a frontier, a place where Catholic Western Europe, Orthodox Eastern Christianity, pagan tribal cultures, and the advancing ambitions of military orders all collided. The Teutonic Knights were one of the most formidable forces on that frontier. Founded originally during the Crusades in the Holy Land, this German military order had pivoted its ambitions northward and eastward by the early 13th century. They had been invited into Prussia to help Christianize pagan Baltic tribes, and from there, their power expanded rapidly. They were disciplined, well-equipped, experienced in siege warfare and open battle, and they operated with the blessing of the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. They were not simply soldiers, they were an institution. Alongside them operated the Livonian Order, a branch of the Sword Brothers, another crusading military order that controlled large swaths of what is now Estonia and Latvia. By 1237, the Livonian Order had been absorbed into the Teutonic Knights as a semi-autonomous branch, creating a formidable unified military presence along the eastern Baltic coast. To the east of this expanding crusader frontier lay the Novgorod Republic, a remarkable political entity that deserves a moment of attention because it was unlike almost anything else in the medieval world. Novgorod was not a monarchy in the traditional sense. It was governed by a council of wealthy merchants and boyars, the noble class, and it had a tradition of electing and dismissing its own princes. The Prince of Novgorod was essentially a hired military commander, brought in when needed and sent away when the city decided he had overstayed his welcome. This is a crucial detail, because the man at the center of our story, Alexander, the prince who would earn the name Nevsky, was not an unchallenged ruler. He was a servant of Novgorod's political will. And that tension would shape everything that followed. Now here is the context that makes the Battle of 1242 even more remarkable. The years leading up to it were catastrophic for the lands east of Novgorod. Between 1237 and 1242, the Mongol armies of Batu Khan had swept through the Russian principalities with devastating speed. Vladimir Ryazan Kiev, city after city fell. Historians estimate that the Mongol campaigns killed somewhere between a third and half of the population of the affected regions, though exact figures are genuinely uncertain and debated. The scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible. Novgorod itself was spared, partly because of its northern geography and the spring thaw that made the swampy terrain around the city impassable for Mongol cavalry, and partly because Novgorod's position as a trading republic meant it had resources to negotiate. But the rest of the Russian lands were shattered. The political and military power of the eastern principalities had been broken. This is the world into which the Livonian Order chose to expand, and from a strategic standpoint, the timing made a certain brutal logic. Their eastern neighbors were weakened, fragmented, and reeling. The opportunity seemed obvious. In 1240, the Livonian Order and their allies captured the city of Pskov, a close neighbor and ally of Novgorod. They also took the fortress of Koporai. These were not minor border skirmishes. Pskov was a significant city, and its capture represented a genuine threat to Novgorod's security and trade routes. Here is where Alexander enters the story in earnest, and where the political complexity of Novgorod becomes important. Alexander had already earned a measure of military reputation in July of 1240, when he led Novgorodian forces to a decisive victory over a Swedish force at the confluence of the Neva and Izhora rivers. That victory is where his epithet Nevsky comes from, of the Neva. But here is something that many popular accounts skip over. Shortly after that victory, Novgorod's council expelled Alexander. The exact reasons are not entirely clear from the historical record, but it appears that tensions had developed between the prince and the city's powerful boyar class. He was sent away. Then the Livonian order took Pskov, and suddenly Novgorod needed Alexander back. He was recalled, given command, and tasked with recovering what had been lost. He moved quickly. By the spring of 1041, he had retaken Koporai. In early 1242, he recovered Pskov, reportedly freeing the city without a major battle. The Livonian forces had been pushed back, but they had not been broken. Both sides now understood that a decisive confrontation was coming. The Livonian order sent a raiding force eastward, probing toward Novgorodian territory. Alexander's scouts tracked their movements. The Russian prince made a strategic choice that would define the engagement. He would choose the ground. He pulled his forces back to the eastern shore of Lake Peipus, a massive body of water sitting on the border between what is now Russia and Estonia. In April, the lake was still frozen, though the ice was beginning to weaken as spring advanced. Alexander positioned his army with the frozen lake at their front and the shore at their back. Now, here is where the legend really begins to diverge from the historical record, and it is worth being honest about what we actually know. The primary Russian source for the battle is the First Novgorodian Chronicle, written some decades after the events. There are also references in the Livonian Rhymed Chronicle, a German-language source from the same era that describes the battle from the other side. These two accounts agree on the basic facts. A battle occurred, Alexander's forces won, and the Livonian order suffered a meaningful defeat. But they diverge significantly on the details, the scale, and the dramatic elements. The Livonian Rhymed Chronicle, for instance, mentions that 20 knights were killed and 6 were captured. The Russian Chronicle suggests a far larger number of casualties. Historians debate which account is closer to the truth, and the honest answer is that we simply do not know with precision. What we do know is that the battle happened, that the Livonians lost, and that the defeat had real strategic consequences. The famous detail about the ice breaking beneath the weight of the Teutonic Knights, sending armored men plunging into the freezing water, is one of the most iconic images associated with this battle. It appears in later Russian sources and was memorably dramatized in Sergei Eisenstein's 1938 film, which we will come back to. But it is absent from the earliest accounts. Historians debate whether it happened at all, or whether it was embellished over time. Some scholars suggest that even if the ice did crack in places, the lake in early April may not have been thin enough to cause the catastrophic collapse depicted in later retellings. This is not to say the battle was unimportant. It clearly was important. But the honest historian has to acknowledge that the battle on the ice exists in two forms, the historical event and the legend. And understanding both is essential to understanding why this battle matters. So what actually happened on April 5, 1242? The Livonian force, composed of knights from the order, along with Estonian auxiliary troops and possibly some Danish allies from northern Estonia, advanced across the ice to engage Alexander's army. The Russian forces were positioned with their back to the shore, with the bulk of their strength on the flanks rather than the center. This is consistent with a classic tactic of allowing the enemy to push through the center while the flanks envelop them. Though whether this was deliberate strategy or simply how the battle unfolded, historians disagree. The Livonian knights advanced in what the sources describe as a wedge formation, a classic heavy cavalry tactic designed to punch through an enemy line. They struck the Russian center hard. For a moment, it may have seemed like the formation would work, but the flanks held, and then they pushed back. The Livonian force began to break. The retreat across the ice, under pressure from pursuing Novgorodian cavalry, is where the most dramatic elements of the legend cluster. Whether the ice gave way in places, whether men drowned, whether the pursuit extended for miles along the shore, these details are contested. What is clear is that the battle ended in a decisive Russian victory and that the Livonian order's eastward expansion was checked. The Livonian rhymed chronicle records, with unusual candor for a source written by the losing side, that the Novgorodians had such a great army that perhaps 60 men attacked each German knight. This is almost certainly an exaggeration designed to explain the defeat honorably. But it tells us something interesting. Even the Livonian sources acknowledged that they had lost, and lost badly enough to require explanation. The aftermath of the battle was swift and consequential. The Livonian order sent envoys to Novgorod to negotiate peace. According to the Novgorodian Chronicle, they renounced their claims to the territories they had captured, and the border was essentially restored to its pre-conflict position. There were prisoner exchanges. The immediate military threat to Novgorod was lifted. This is the historical reality of the battle's immediate consequences, significant, real, and genuinely important for Novgorod's security, but not, in the view of most modern historians, the civilization-defining moment it was later portrayed as. So why did it become legendary? Why did this battle, rather than dozens of other medieval conflicts, become one of the most famous military engagements in Russian history? The answer lies not in 1242, but in the centuries that followed, and particularly in one extraordinary moment in the 20th century. Alexander Nevsky was canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church in 1547, nearly 3 centuries after his death. This was a politically significant moment. It came during the reign of Ivan the Terrible, who was actively constructing a powerful, centralized Russian state, and had strong motivations to elevate figures who represented Russian resistance to foreign enemies. Alexander's memory was useful. A prince who had defeated both the Swedes and the Teutonic Knights, who had navigated the complex politics of Mongol overlordship with enough skill to keep Novgorod functioning. This was exactly the kind of historical figure a state-building ruler could celebrate. But the transformation of Alexander Nevsky into a truly iconic national hero came in 1938, with Sergei Eisenstein's film of the same name. And here the story becomes genuinely fascinating. Eisenstein was one of the great filmmakers of the 20th century, the man who had made Battleship Potemkin and October. When Stalin's government commissioned a film about Alexander Nevsky in the late 1930s, the historical and political context was electric. Nazi Germany was rising. The Soviet Union was anxious about the threat from the West. A film about a Russian prince defeating German knights was not subtle propaganda. It was not meant to be. Eisenstein's film is a masterpiece of cinema. The battle sequence on the ice remains one of the most stunning pieces of filmmaking in history. The image of armored German knights sinking through breaking ice, the sweeping orchestral score by Sergei Prokofiev, the heroic figure of Alexander rallying his people. It is genuinely magnificent. And it is also, in important ways, a work of creative imagination rather than historical reconstruction. The film amplified every dramatic element of the battle: the ice breaking, the scale of the conflict, the villainy of the Teutonic Knights, portrayed with almost cartoonish menace. The heroism of the Russian common soldiers. It created the visual language through which most people for generations would understand the battle on the ice. Here is the remarkable thing. The film was pulled from Soviet cinemas in 1939, when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact made Nazi Germany temporarily an ally of the Soviet Union. It was re-released in 1941, the moment Germany invaded. The battle on the ice became, in the minds of millions of Soviet citizens, a template for the current war. Alexander Nevsky was not just a medieval prince. He was a symbol of Russian survival against Western aggression. This is the power of historical memory. The Battle of 1242 became a lens through which an entire civilization processed its most traumatic 20th century experience, and in doing so it was transformed into something far larger than the original event. But let us return to the man himself, because Alexander Nevsky is a genuinely complicated historical figure, one that the legend tends to flatten. His military victories against the Swedes and the Livonians are real and documented. But he was also a prince who chose to cooperate with the Mongol overlordship of the Golden Horde rather than resist it. He traveled to the Mongol court multiple times. He helped the Mongols collect tribute from Russian cities. He reportedly suppressed at least one anti-Mongol uprising. These are documented facts, not accusations. Some historians have argued that this cooperation was pragmatic wisdom, that Alexander understood the Mongols were an unstoppable force and that resistance would only bring more destruction to an already devastated land. Others have argued that his cooperation enabled the Mongol yoke to continue for far longer than it might have otherwise. This debate is genuine and unresolved. What is certain is that the version of Alexander Nevsky celebrated in Russian national memory is a selective one. He is remembered for defeating the Western Crusaders and almost entirely forgotten for his accommodation of the Eastern Mongols. The selection of which parts of a historical figure's life to remember and which to forget is never accidental. It reflects the needs and anxieties of the societies doing the remembering. The lake itself, Lake Peipus, called Peipsi in Estonian, sits today on the border between Russia and Estonia. It is one of the largest lakes in Europe. For centuries, the exact location of the battle was unknown. Medieval sources are vague about the precise spot. Soviet-era archaeological expeditions searched for physical evidence of the battle and found frustratingly little. No mass graves, no significant deposits of weapons or armor, nothing that would definitively mark the battlefield. This absence of physical evidence has fueled debate. Some historians have questioned whether the battle was as large as the sources suggest. Others note that medieval battlefields are notoriously difficult to locate and that the lake itself may have swallowed much of the evidence. The lack of archaeological confirmation does not mean the battle did not happen, it clearly did. But it does mean that our picture of it remains incomplete. In 1993, a joint Russian-Estonian expedition using modern sonar and underwater archaeology techniques searched the lake bed in the most likely area. They found some medieval artifacts, but nothing that definitively resolved the questions about scale or precise location. The battle remains, in a physical sense, partly invisible. There is something almost poetic about that. A battle that became one of the most famous in history, that was dramatized in one of the most celebrated films ever made, that gave a name to a national hero, and yet the lake keeps its secrets. What we can say with confidence is this: the battle on the ice was a real military engagement that had real strategic consequences. It stopped the Livonian Order's eastward expansion at a critical moment. It preserved Novgorod's independence and its Orthodox Christian identity against Catholic crusading pressure. These are not trivial outcomes, but it was not, as some later accounts claimed, a battle that saved Russia from absorption into a German-dominated Catholic Europe. The scale of the Livonian threat, while real, was not existential in the way the Mongol invasion had been. The Teutonic Knights were a formidable regional power, not a civilization-ending force. The battle checked them. It did not destroy them. The order continued to exist and operate in the Baltic for centuries afterward. The gap between the historical event and the legend is not a reason to dismiss the battle. It is a reason to find it more interesting. Because the story of how the battle on the ice became legendary tells us something profound about how societies construct their identities, how they choose their heroes, and how the past is always being rewritten to serve the present. Every generation that has told this story has told a slightly different version. The Novgorodian chroniclers emphasized Alexander's piety and military skill. The Orthodox Church emphasized his sanctity. Ivan the Terrible's era emphasized his role as a defender of Russian statehood. Eisenstein and Stalin emphasized his role as a defender against Western aggression. Post-Soviet Russia has continued to celebrate him. He was voted the greatest Russian of all time in a 2008 television poll, ahead of figures like Peter the Great and Pushkin. Each of these versions is a reflection of its time as much as a reflection of the man. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the battle on the ice. History is not just what happened. It is what we need to have happened. The frozen lake of 1242 has become a kind of mirror, and different eras have looked into it and seen different things. The Teutonic Knights, for their part, did not disappear. They continued to operate in the Baltic, fighting, converting, and building. Their legacy is woven into the history of Prussia, of Germany, of the Baltic states. The crusading orders of the medieval Baltic are not a simple story of villains and heroes. They were complex institutions operating in a complex world, and the peoples they encountered had their own complexities in turn. The Estonian and Latvian peoples who lived under Livonian order rule for centuries have their own relationship with this history, one that is not always identical to the Russian national narrative. For them, the medieval period is a story of subjugation, cultural suppression, and eventual national awakening. The battle on the ice appears in their history too, but from a different angle. This multiplicity of perspectives is not a problem to be solved. It is the nature of history itself. What remains, after all the layers of legend and politics and filmmaking are peeled away, is a moment on a frozen lake in early April, more than 750 years ago. Real men, in the cold, fighting for territory and faith and survival. A battle that one side won, and one side lost. A prince who made choices, some heroic, some morally complicated, and who navigated one of the most dangerous political environments in medieval European history with enough skill to keep his city alive. That is already a remarkable story. It does not need the ice to crack on cue. It does not need the dramatic orchestral swell. The reality, in all its ambiguity, is more interesting than the legend, because it reminds us that history is made by human beings, not heroes, and that the difference between a forgotten skirmish and a legendary battle is often not the battle itself, but the storytelling that follows. The lake is still there, cold and vast and quiet, and somewhere beneath its waters, or buried in the sediment of its shores, the evidence of that April day in 1242 waits. Perhaps one day archaeology will give us a clearer picture. Perhaps it will not. Either way, the story will continue to be told, because some battles are fought with swords and lances on frozen water, and others are fought across centuries in chronicles and films and national memory for the right to define who a people are and where they came from. Alexander Nevsky won both kinds of battle. Whether he deserved to win both is a question historians are still debating. And honestly, that debate is exactly what makes this story worth telling. If this video made you think differently about the battle on the ice, or about how legends are built around real events, drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think matters more, the historical battle as it actually happened, or the legend that grew around it and shaped the identity of millions of people? There is no easy answer, and I genuinely want to know where you land. If you appreciate history told this way, honest about uncertainty, serious about complexity, and never dumbed down, subscribing to this channel is the best way to make sure you do not miss what comes next. And in our next video, we are going to look at another medieval military order whose story intersects with this one in unexpected ways, the rise and fall of the Teutonic Knights themselves, and how a military institution born in the Holy Land ended up reshaping the map of Northern Europe. It is a story of ambition, religion, and the strange ways that crusading ideology outlasted the Crusades themselves. You will not want to miss it. But let us sit with one more thread before we close, because it connects the medieval past to something genuinely surprising about the modern world. The name Nevsky did not fade quietly into the pages of academic journals. It remained alive in a way that few medieval figures manage. Streets, cities, a famous boulevard in St. Petersburg, the Nevsky Prospect, one of the most famous avenues in all of Russia, carry his name. A Russian nuclear submarine was named after him. The Russian Orthodox Church celebrates his feast day. He appears on monuments, in school textbooks, on postage stamps. The machinery of national memory has worked continuously across very different political systems to keep Alexander Nevsky present in the cultural landscape. This persistence across such radically different eras, Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union, and the post-Soviet Russian Federation, is itself historically significant. It tells us that the need for this particular symbol has not diminished. If anything, it has intensified at moments of external pressure or national uncertainty. When a society feels threatened from the outside, Alexander Nevsky tends to reappear at the center of public conversation. The pattern is almost mechanical in its regularity. That is not cynicism. It is simply how national mythology works in Russia and everywhere else. Every culture has its Nevsky, a figure from the distant past who gets recruited again and again to explain the present. The specifics change, the function remains the same. What is unusual about Alexander Nevsky is the sheer durability of his symbolic power across such a long span of time and such dramatically different political contexts. A saint of the Orthodox Church who is simultaneously a hero of Soviet cinema, a medieval prince who wins a modern television poll, a figure claimed by both religious conservatives and secular nationalists. That kind of symbolic flexibility is rare, and it speaks to something deep in the way this story has been constructed and maintained. It also raises a question worth sitting with. When a historical figure becomes this embedded in national identity, does it become harder to see them clearly? Does the legend eventually make honest historical inquiry feel almost like an act of hostility? Some Russian historians who have questioned the scale of the battle on the ice, or who have written critically about Alexander's cooperation with the Mongols, have found themselves in uncomfortable positions, accused not of bad scholarship, but of bad patriotism. That conflation of historical criticism with political disloyalty is a warning sign worth recognizing wherever it appears. History belongs to everyone who is willing to look at it honestly. The battle on the ice is a genuinely important event. Alexander Nevsky was a genuinely significant figure. Neither of those facts requires us to accept every layer of legend that has accumulated around them. In fact, stripping away the legend, carefully, respectfully, with attention to what the sources actually say, makes the real story richer, not poorer. A frozen lake, two armies, a medieval prince navigating an impossible world, and then, across the centuries, an entire civilization deciding what that moment meant. That is history at its most human. If this story left you with more questions than answers, that is exactly the right response. The best history always does. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What surprised you most? Was it the gap between the legend and the historical record, or the story of how the legend itself was built? Subscribe if you want more history told this way. Without the myths, without the filler, and without pretending that the past is simpler than it actually was. And stay tuned for our next video, where we follow the Teutonic Knights beyond this frozen battlefield and into the story of how a crusading military order helped shape the political destiny of Northern Europe for centuries to come.